Hi, welcome to my presentation, Baby You're the Star, a solo story. How education, creative, and business trends influence the lack of black bands signed to major record labels. I'm Professor Marcus Thomas. I'm Associate Professor and Chair of Music and Performing Arts Management at the Hartt School of Music, Dance, and Theater at the University of Hartford. And I'm looking today at the decline of black bands that are signed to major labels. So we have a few definitions. We're looking at black bands that are on major label rosters, and I'm defining that as a black band as a band that is predominantly black members or led by a notable black lead singer or lead musician. The major labels that we're looking at are Warner Music Group, Universal Music Group, and Sony Music. And we're only looking at the current rosters, not legacy artists or imprints that may be signed to legacy re-releases. I considered all genres, but the impacts show themselves to be greatest in the R&B and soul subgenres. So what has happened over the last few decades or so that has led to this decline? There have been a few trends that are of note. Political trends such as the reduction of music and arts programming in elementary and secondary education. There have been technological advances such as the availability of MIDI instruments and multi-track recording. Business changes like the rise of R&B production-led labels. Marketing preferences such as commercial radio encouraging more unified sound in music. And there have been financial implications as well, like the cost of promoting a solo artist or a vocal group as opposed to a full band. And then the legal and contractual issues that arise in things like artist royalties and publishing revenues as well. And all of these have had in some way, shape, or form an impact that have led to the decline on black bands being signed to major labels. Now, if we were to go back to the 70s, the 80s, black bands proliferated across the landscape. Most major labels had multiple bands signed to their roster, including bands like Parliament Funkadelic, Earth, Wind and Fire, Atlantic Starr, Sly and the Family Stone. And we had several of these bands actually that released music across multiple major labels. So they not only had a deal with one major, they had multiple deals at different points in their career. Many of these bands defied neat genre classifications. Groups like Sly and the Family Stone, Prince and the Revolution, Parliament Funkadelic, they were rock, they were funk, they were R&B, they were soul, they were all this blend of music that went outside of normal genre classifications. A lot of these bands also defied and challenged gender and racial norms of the time. So bands like Sly and the Family Stone prominently featured both men and women, black and white. And this model was followed by Prince and the Revolution as well. And you had Climax, which was an all-female led band, which was pretty forward-looking within R&B at the time. There were several solo acts that came from the band tradition, such as Lionel Richie from the Commodores, Philip Bailey, who was a member of Earth, Wind and Fire as well. So what was it about bands that made them special? What did they contribute? In particular, their radio and live performance imbued the world with the brilliance of musical collaboration, the genius of collective improvisation through jazz-infused funk, gospel-inspired R&B, what we would call the sounds of blackness. They were masters at playing off of and playing with one another on stage and in studio as well. Now, this tradition didn't end at the end of the 80s. We also had a late entry into what I would call black bands on this same tradition. That was Mint Condition. Although they were formed in the mid-1980s, they were discovered by Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, and their first album project came out in 1991. Mint Condition might be considered probably the last of the black bands signed into the R&B genre. So where are we today? At the review of major label rosters that are readily available, there are 17 current black bands that are signed, and again, these do not include legacy artists. Among those 17 bands, 11 of them are in the jazz genre. 2 in R&B, 2 rock, 1 hip-hop, and 1 country, although the bands, the artists themselves may largely deny particular genre classifications. These are where I see them most likely aligning. If you were to remove jazz as a genre, you would only have 6 bands, black bands, signed to major labels. If we then further remove, for example, Hootie and the Blowfish, which has only 1 black member, then you might only have 5 bands that are signed to major labels at this point. Blue Note Records accounts for 9 of the 17 black bands that are signed at the moment, and of course they're all in the jazz genre. Now, I love jazz, and there's nothing wrong with that, but the indicator for jazz as a motivation for kids to learn music isn't as great in terms of commercial music, because jazz isn't a large share of the sales, and so most young people aren't listening to jazz or following jazz to say, well, hey, that's what I want to do as a career. Jazz isn't particularly influential among the youth. If we were to look at the 3 major labels in comparison, minus Blue Note Records, Warner Music Group accounts for 2 of the bands on the list. That's Silk Sonic, which is a brand new collaboration between Bruno Mars and Anderson .Paak, and Meet Me at the Altar. It's a punk band, a trio of young ladies. Universal Music accounts for 5 of the bands on the list. Again, Hootie and the Blowfish being one of them, which I do consider to be a black band. They're led by a prominent black artist. Bluephoria is a rock band. Hero the band. Sons of Kemet and Shabaka and the Ancestors, and they have some common membership, so you might even call them 1.5 bands. And they're, again, those are jazz offerings. Sony Music Group accounts for only 1 band on the list, and that's The Internet, the hip-hop band, The Internet. Now, I did not look at the alternative labels, ADA, Fontana, or Red, that are associated with the major labels, since those would be considered largely indies. Now, the decline in bands happened across the board. It's not unique to black artists. Bands signed to major labels have decreased in all genres. But there is a significant difference when it comes to black musicians versus the impact on white musicians. Some genres, particularly those that are primarily not associated with black artists, tend to prefer or favor band configuration. So when you think of rock, you think of metal, alternative, punk, country. These are genres that still largely rely on and pull inspiration from the band configuration as the artist. So it's more likely that you'll find a larger percentage of these bands, and in fact you do, signed to major labels than you do over in more traditionally black genres. So what has gotten us to this point after a few decades? One of the biggest things has been the defunding of music and arts education. So over the last 30 to 40 years, we've seen funding dwindle for putting music into schools, as we have started to prioritize what's considered to be core education, which would include English, math, science, social studies, and arguably these are incredibly important subjects, but very often arts and music are seen as not as important, or perhaps elective luxuries, and therefore can be early on the chopping block as budgets start to get tightened. Arts education tends to be an expensive endeavor. You know, it's more expensive by the ratio, as opposed to a math class where you have maybe 30 or 40 kids. A lot of times in arts and music classes, they're much smaller in terms of student to teacher ratio. And in a studio class, it might be one-on-one even. So therefore, in a lot of contexts, arts and music courses are just seen as delivering less bang for the buck. And this continues into higher ed, into post-secondary education, such as at the collegiate level. When we're looking across the university for where we can tighten budgets, often the arts come into the crosshairs because of this very low ratio of teacher to student interaction and the cost of delivering that education. What gets lost in the translation lots of times is the importance, the significance of learning the arts, the significance of engaging in the arts and what it does to better our lives. And that very often gets lost in the conversation, which then puts these programs in jeopardy. Studies have also shown that fewer kids take the arts, music and all other arts for that matter, when they're not compulsory. If it's elective or something that's going to be an after-school project, it's less likely that the kids will actually take it. And the lack of access to music education typically disproportionately impacts students from historically excluded populations, whether it be Black or Latinx, and also students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds as well. A recent study from the National Center for Education Statistics concluded that in public elementary schools, those that have a high poverty concentration, that would be students typically eligible for free or reduced lunches, 89% of those schools offered some music curriculum for the entire school year. Many of them were only part-time. When you got into lower poverty concentration schools, the number increased to 93 to 96%. In secondary schools, the gap gets much wider. High poverty concentration secondary schools featured music year-round, only 81% of the time, and lower poverty concentration, 95 to 96%. So we can see a gap as small as 4%, but as wide as 15%, depending on the school that we're looking at. So as students move into high school, those that are in lower income areas or higher poverty concentration areas tend to have less access to the arts. Along with the reduction in arts programming and arts funding, we've also had an increase in availability of technology. We've had cost-effective multi-track recording explode since the late 70s going into the early 80s. So now one musician could go in and overdub multiple vocal parts or multiple instrumental parts. Now in the early 80s, this typically still meant that that musician would have to be pretty adept on multiple instruments. So we think of someone like Prince, who could go into the studio and on his first couple of albums play all of the instruments and do all the vocals and everything else. Still required a great deal of musical skill as well as the multi-track recorder. As we get to the mid-80s, going into the late 80s, we get the proliferation of MIDI instruments, musical instrument digital interface. So as instruments become digital, we can now connect them in serial in such ways that one instrument, one keyboard module, can recreate all the sounds of an entire band, an entire orchestra, if you'd like. And over the years, these have gotten even better. So in the initial days, you could have a songwriter, producer, create an entire arrangement out of one or two keyboards, and increasingly it's just one keyboard. But then over the last 20 years, sampling technology, samplers and loop libraries have gotten so good that it's very difficult sometimes to distinguish between a real instrument and a sampled instrument. And also with loop libraries, you can simply arrange and edit performances of musicians directly into your composition. So again, reduces the need to collaborate with live musicians if you have this sort of technology at your fingertips. Now, moving from the 80s into the 90s, this directly impacted R&B music in a very big way, and it later spilled into pop music because we get the change in business model where the major labels start to fund and support R&B-led or producer-led R&B labels. So late 80s, early 90s, we have production teams such as L.A. Reid and Babyface, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis that get vanity deals for their own labels, and now their responsibility is to discover, develop, and then ultimately deliver completed talent to the major labels for release. And incidentally, L.A. Reid and Babyface, of course, come from a band tradition. They were in the deal. Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis come from a band tradition. They were also in the time. So these musicians were originally in collaborative arrangements, but then found it very efficient and very convenient to be able to produce using small instruments, MIDI, and small studios, arrangement studios, to fully develop an artist and then deliver a fully developed master. On the heels of their successes, we also had other producers such as Teddy Riley, Jermaine Dupri, Dallas Austin, Timbaland, that also got vanity label deals to develop talent and deliver to the label. Now, these producers were still heavily concentrated in doing R&B, and then spilling over to pop, and of course, a few of them also work in hip-hop genres as well. So as music starts to get very well produced and what I would call, high polished music, the sound of radio starts to change as well. And so commercial radio starts to prefer this homogenization of music. And this is the sort of thing that encourages and supports what's already happening with producers. So you could get one producer like Babyface who could dominate the charts and have multiple songs on the charts at one time because the radio stations are preferring that sound. The station's playlists get narrow, the sound gets narrow, and therefore things like bands and different sounds, different types of music start to get squeezed out to the fringes at that point. There are also financial and legal requirements involved in a band versus a solo artist or having a vocal group. Vocal groups and solo artists can be cheaper. Many bands, many artists tour with a full band. So if you think of Jill Scott or Erykah Badu, they travel with the band. NDRE travels with the band. But they can also rehearse or perform to tracks if necessary. And in today's production world, the tracks can be full-on Pro Tools arrangements with multiple rigs running simultaneously, containing all of the performance tracks, background vocals, the same way you would hear it on a record, to perfection. And so the artist now has the option of not touring with the band, so it can be a lot cheaper. Sometimes things don't go well in a band, and it is quite frankly easier to replace someone in a vocal group, or you only have one solo artist to deal with in terms of a personality. Once you have a band, you've got more personalities to deal with. You also have potential for more breach points in a contract because you've got 8 people that have to stay in accordance with their contract, unless you have some that are designated as key members or primary members. Otherwise, you've got 8 people that you're responsible for, as opposed to maybe 2 or maybe 3 or the 1, for example. The record labels have not historically paid greater royalties for bands than solo artists. So this doesn't exactly encourage people to join a group if you're going to make the same royalty. If an artist is going to make the same money going solo as opposed to being in the band, then they may elect to go solo at the first convenient moment they have, or perhaps they never join a band in the first place. Also, for performance fees, those fees may not be higher for a band versus the artist either. And so there's not an incentive for the artist to split 4 or 5 or 6 ways if they don't have to. And lastly, it's not uncommon that you have 2 members perhaps in a band that do the primary songwriting. If they don't have some sort of a band partnership agreement in place, then you may have a publishing inequity where they're all making money on the record sales, or they'd like to make money on the record sales. They're making money on tour, but then when the publishing money starts to come in, only 2 members are getting paid. And sometimes that can lead to a rift if there isn't an agreement in place for how the publishing should be handled up front. So all of this has, in many different ways, impacted the desire for artists to be in bands, and therefore the desire for labels to sign bands or to deal with it. So the cumulative effects of all this are, without access to music education, fewer kids actually learn to play traditional instruments. So they've favored things like MIDI synthesizers and drum machines, or turntables for that matter. And fewer kids learn to play collaborative music in a band, where you're relying on other musicians for feedback, for the groove, for the feel. Without the financial incentive or equity, you also have fewer musicians seeking to form bands in the first place that will just go solo if they can and hire a band to go on the road. If a band is together, it's harder to keep the core together if the finances and equity aren't put in place. And so then if you wind up with fewer bands in promotional channels on television, on radio, or on YouTube, you have fewer models for kids to see and emulate, to say, hey, I'd like to do that too. I want to be in a band and learn to play with other people. And so then band-oriented music tends to get displaced in genres like pop and R&B that tend to heavily favor the boy band model or the vocal group or pop group model. So some possible solutions to rectify this, first would be the investment in nonprofit arts education programs. And there are just too many in the country to mention, so I mentioned a few that I think have pretty interesting models. The Artist Collective here in Hartford, Connecticut, for example, it's a community-based music, dance, and theater collective where students from the inner city are able to go and take low-cost lessons to prepare them for conservatory entry after high school. Or Kids in Baltimore, Maryland is the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra's before, during, and after school program for kids to learn to play classical music and classical instruments. And then there's education through through music, down in New York City. And they partner with schools that may not have music programs, but they bring in the teachers or educators through a partnership to offer in-school or after-school lessons on site. Other solutions might include the restructuring of labels themselves and what they prefer. Restructuring label contracts as partnerships with larger royalties. So there's a bigger slice of the pie to go around to band members. Now, this may be more likely to happen in the coming years because the trend would suggest that more artists are increasingly deciding to remain independent and not signed to major labels, and that may then entice the labels, or require the labels, I should say, to start to be a little more generous with the royalty structure in order to entice bands, artists back onto their labels. Can also promote band-oriented genres through increased technology. Whereas commercial radio might have become a bit bland, there's ample room on the internet, whether it be through streaming services or YouTube or other, to promote alternative genres, not necessarily in the genre alternative, but things outside of the mainstream, anything outside of the mainstream. The promotion channels aren't quite as limited, so there are more avenues today than ever before. Of course, there's a lot of traffic in those avenues, but with the right curation and the right company promoting, there's still a way to kind of have your artist gain recognition. Final solution would be from the consumer fan perspective, support band-oriented genres, listen and purchase band-oriented music. This helps to move the metrics, and therefore if it's seen as influential, then it's more likely that the major labels get interested and start to put money and investment back into the genre because the fans are asking for it. Explore and support bands that are indie, that are rock and punk. There are lots of black bands that are doing these genres of music. They're not signed to major labels yet, so they're not on the radar. Many of them are below the radar, whether it be Sophia Urista or Oxymorons, Shinge. They're all excellent artists that just have not made it to the mainstream just yet. But the more support they receive, the metrics start to move, and the major labels, without a doubt, start to take an interest. So that's my presentation. I hope you found it informative, and I would welcome any questions that you may have. Thank you.